of the priesthood of Melchizedek. Where did these ideas come from? The Old Testament.
Yep.
You know, Melchizedek, who's that? We only come across him in the book of Genesis, one little time. You know, so you got to go, what does this mean? Now we're talking about the law. Perhaps you're saying, yeah, we have to be careful there. But it's a tricky one. You know, I mean, someone gave my wife a plaque, a nice, real nice picture frame. And it was a quotation, Jeremiah 29. For I know the plans I have for you, to give you hope, and if you, not to hurt you or harm you, but to give you plan. And it had a name on it, Lisa, comma, as if God was speaking to her. Now that's a lovely sentiment, but the actual truth is it's ripped out of context. That verse was aimed at the Israelite nation that was about to go into exile. And so you go, can you take that promise and apply it to Lisa? You really can't, because it's applied to the Israelites that were about to go into exile, and God was telling them, listen, things seem terrible now, but I have a plan for your future, to give you hope and a future. So it's really addressed to the Israelite nation. So you have to be aware of to whom these things were written and so forth, that there's an original audience. That's why when you get into your exegetical work, your exegesis paper, you have to be careful to distinguish, well, who were the original, let's say, recipients of this letter or book or whatever, if you can determine that. Because you have to look at that and say, okay, and that somehow relates to our life as a church. Because people have preached wonderful sermons on Jeremiah 29, but it's actually out of context. You just take it and apply it for today. You know, so
if it becomes a word that we call rema for an individual, you can apply. For example, I baked a cake. You were not at Jacob's party.
No.
His father ordered a cake, and I gave him a present. And I said, what do you want on the cake? And he said I should put Jeremiah this. Because when his mother had him, 5 days later she died. So he said, this boy might grow up thinking that God doesn't love me, blah, blah, blah. So he's speaking prophetically onto his son's life. And he said, put this inscription on his cake. You know, I know that the context of it in Jeremiah is to do with the Israelites. But you can pick the word of God if it's rhema for you and speak it into a situation.
Yeah.
And that's where we have to look at, you know, when we say, if you're going to take Jeremiah 29 and apply it to that, you're going to have to look at the context and say, well, how can we just, you know, because you can make the same argument with this gal saying that the law applies to men and women wearing different clothing. You know, so you have to be careful. Anyway, let's move on with that. So, where does the authority lie, with elected or self-appointed leaders? Do you have elected pastors? For those of you that are currently pastors, were you put into position by someone else, or did you start a church? How did you come to be pastors? Some of you are pastors. How did you come to be? Were you born a pastor when you were a baby?
God called us.
He may have called you, but someone recognized you.
Like Jeremiah. Before I born, I was anointed.
How did you get the actual job? Did you apply for a job? Did you plant a church and say, hey, you know what, I'm the pastor? And people came. How did it happen?
I've been elected.
A prayer group with praying, but I had my calls already. I told you last time. I had my calls. We were in a prayer group, and it happened that in one night of praying, God said, I wanted this to be a church.
Yeah. So it happened. It wasn't. You weren't
elected.
Let's say.
I can't say elected, because God said that I need this to be a church. We started the church without anyone as a leader.
Right.
Okay.
So you became,
because on that time, you know, on my time was everything must go through the prayer and the revelation.
But did you choose or
Yes, that's the problem, because that time was deep on the Assembly of God, and we went there to pray and go. Speak on Professor, there was a lady who prophesied that this is the pastor, I want him to lead you. That's not
so it happened that
elected, yeah. It's different, there's so many ways.
This is it. That's what we're saying is.
So, do you call that kind of person self-appointed?
You could.
No.
A spirit
I don't
appointed.
agree with that.
That is a spirit appointed.
They weren't elected by other human beings. Let's
Yeah.
say. So these are the kind of questions that, but when you start analyzing the answers to these questions, it will tell you a lot about your denomination or your church's tradition, let's say.
As Pastor
You know,
George
is it,
says, how the church does.
is the authority, is it an
Chantal,
independent church?
is it
Going on to the
self-appointed?
next one.
Self-election.
Is your church completely independent?
But you know that this to election in the church, it is a big issue.
Or it can be, yeah.
I'll give you an example of Assembly of God in Congo. There was a man who started it in Congo, Assembly of God. When there was a Theologie come and he went back, they got started. He thought that he's supposed to be the leader because he's the one who started
The job.
the church, the job there.
Yeah.
And a few times there was a Pastor Verno, he's a well-known American pastor from Assembly of God, and he came there, and God sent him to gather to be a leader of the church, but the old man didn't want him, and they threw him out. They elected him, and the church started to go down.
So they threw the old man out or the American?
The American, they threw him out, and he started his own church.
Yeah,
We're still part of Assembly of God also.
right.
And
Yeah.
the church went down. That election is,
Yeah.
we are human beings, and
We
with
make
human
mistakes.
beings you can expect everything.
We all make mistakes. And we think sometimes that God is leading us. I mean, we hired a head elder at our church when I was just one of the elders. We fasted, we prayed, we did the whole thing. Everything seemed like we were supposed to hire this guy. It ended up in a complete disaster. The church nearly fell apart, you know. And you think, well, we make mistakes. We overlooked a lot of things. Looking at this next one, authority in the local church. Is your church an independent church? Or are you part of a larger denomination?
Independent.
So you have no ties to, like, Nazarene, Baptist,
No.
Assembly of God? You're a completely
No.
independent church?
No, we are interdependent actually.
Ah, wait a minute, she's saying no, she's saying yes.
We are interdependent because we have,
Interdependent.
you know, when the church started, I won't go into the whole history, I think Pastor must have told you, because people come into the church, you know, and they meet it when it's already flowing. But when the church, you know, started, it wasn't a church. We were part of a church, you know, and then we did a lot of witnessing among people who come into Manchester who don't have a home, you know, a home church. They left. Our church is made up of people from different denominations. So we thought, okay, this church that we were going to, we wanted them to come to our church with us. So they came to our church with us. But it's like the church didn't want to understand or know about the diversity, you know. And then we had, you know, conferences when we were still in the old church, and God gave a word, you know, to Pastor Emmanuel and said, "You have stayed in this mountain long enough. Move."
Time to move on.
So God gave him a word, you know, to move on, and it was confirmed, you know. So that's how we came and started, you know, a church.
So are you
know.
still connected to the
Yeah,
church?
when we started
So it
the
wasn't a
church,
split necessarily like
no,
the ugly.
no, we told
Yeah.
the elders of that church we were going to, so we wanted to start this church and this church, and they said, no, don't start, you know, this, and you know, later they said they gave us 3 weeks, and they prayed over it, and in the end it's okay, Emmanuel, you and your family can go and start, but all the people that are in the church, even though we brought them to the church, I said, no, we told the people, don't follow us. Just stay there. God has called us as a family, and we went to start this church. Some of them came back. They, you know, they found their way towards us. Some came back and went back.
Yeah, they will do.
But the thing is, we submitted ourselves to Assemblies of God. But Assemblies of God is, when you are a part of it, Assemblies of God UK, it is semi-autonomous.
Yeah.
They believe that God
Because
calls a
special-
man and gives him a vision.
Special status.
You know, the Assemblies of God endorse that. That God calls a man and gives him a vision to follow his vision. All we do with Assemblies of the first 2 years of the church, we were under probation.
Yeah.
When pastor was doing things, and God has given our pastor is a man with a big vision. We've done very big projects. So the Assemblies of God, you know, we had a superintendent, like a father to us. If he says don't do it, we didn't do it. You know. But then it's evolved. But then we had to tell Assemblies of God that
Yes.
we are also connected to other people who are not Assemblies of God. But the fact that Assemblies of God is autonomous gave us the leeway. We relate to people all over in different churches. So people come from America, people come from Asia, people come from to minister, not just with us, but we as a hub for other ministers in Manchester. So that's how, so we are in a way interdependent, even though God gave a man a vision and was endorsed by the Assemblies of God.
All right, and that's very good. You're very passionate about it, I can see.
No, because some of these people, as a pastor tells them, they have come into the church and joined, the church. So, like you said, you didn't know the history that the church that you grew up from was part of the Keswick revival. So along the line, some of these things, are said. And then we have different pastors in our church, not that it works as well or whatever, who, when we have conflict things, pastor calls the pastors together. But of course, pastors don't want to commit themselves.
No. Let's move on. I mean, we're going to take a look at some of these other church models, but we don't have time to go through all these questions. But the reason I bring these questions up, and like I say, you can take these as your template for your essays and things, because when you get into this issue of who has the final say,
Is the pastor.
in difficult decisions, whatever your answer
Is the pastor.
that will
That's really
determine a
the part
lot.
of the church,
Because you may think you have the final say, but you actually don't, because a lot of times, as we'll see, the different models of church, when push comes to shove, you're going to find out where the real power resides. Sometimes it's with the people who have the most money, sometimes who've been there the longest, or who've been there for the oldest.
First thing you're supposed to pray and listen of the word of the God. Maybe some prophecy will come.
Yeah.
Like light.
Yeah, but don't forget to give us the wisdom also.
Yeah.
To deal with everything.
But start with the prayer.
These questions, and they're quite helpful for basically critically assessing your church, your place of ministry. As I say, these answers to this question are basically.
Can I have one question? Let's speak, please.
They will basically write your essay
Thank
for
you.
you.
You have a
No.
Now, looking at this, we'll just spend a couple of minutes looking at some of these different models. The Episcopal Church model, this is in theory, this is how this is supposed to work.
What is mean episcopal?
To be an Episcopal Church, it means one
Together.
person's at the head.
Is ecumenism.
No.
No, not ecumenism.
But because ecumenism is the devil things.
Ecumenism is churches working together,
Together, different church.
regardless of
Different.
denomination.
That's the devil.
Catholic.
God is not in ecumenism.
We can't get into that now. This is the model of the Catholic Church, for example. Now they would say, of course, God is the head of the church. You have the bishop, in this case, the Pope. Underneath the Pope, archbishops, cardinals, archdeacons, priests, and then the laity. And again, strengths and weaknesses of this model. You've seen it historically. The Pope, if he gets it right, which in the Catholic tradition they believe he speaks ex cathedra, the very words of God, he is the vicar of Christ on earth, etc. He makes a decision, and that's what it is. If he's truly a man of God, if he's truly hearing from God, that's a positive thing, because in theory, no matter where you go around the world, you're going to hear the same message. Of course, that's not really the case, is it? People are definitely disagree with the Pope they're within the Catholic Church, But look how far down the line the laity is. There's a lot of layers of, let's say, professional clergy to be not, well, put it one way. Lots of archbishops, archdeacons, cardinals, priests. By the time you get down to the laity, there's a lot of removal between the Pope and the average Catholic, let's say, or Episcopal church member. So and we've seen this model has led itself wide open to abuse. There's been a lot of abuse of people by priests and cardinals and bishops and so forth that haven't gone their way back up the chain, or when they have, they didn't want to know. So there's possibility of abuse of the system. And looking at a Presbyterian model, it's a much different system, isn't it? You got a massive church conference, or what they call a synod, right? That could be nationwide, it could be worldwide. A national church conference, right? And then you might have then a local pastor, perhaps lay leaders on the same level. So a team, perhaps. You might have a pastor who's appointed, church board of elders underneath the pastor and the leadership team. Under that, then you have the congregation. Is this more like? Does this resonate with your church leadership structure? Would you consider yourself on the same level as a lay leadership team, or would you say they'd be underneath? Because this is the thing, again, you look at the strengths and weaknesses. This would be your local church down here, underneath, let's say, a nationwide or even a worldwide. Some of the advantages are financial support. If every church gives a little bit of money to the general conference, they can then parcel it out in places where they can't afford to hire a pastor. So that's a potential advantage, isn't it? Or they could plant a church somewhere. They could take a pastor and say, okay, we want to send you over here. There's no money to support you, but we, the conference, will support you from the general fund that's been given by, you've got massive churches that can afford to give extra, perhaps. And then they can support smaller churches that are struggling, And then you might have a local church. But then, who's in charge here? Is it the pastor or lay leaders or the elders underneath the congregation? Sometimes decisions are very difficult to make because you got to appeal to the general conference. You can't make a decision on a local level. You have to say, well, we have to pass it up the chain, and it could take years to get a decision. And sometimes I've seen this before. If you got a pastor, you're trying to sack this person, it's almost impossible because the authority lies up here. To remove this pastor, we had a situation in this church where I was a part of that had a similar structure. This guy he had affairs with people in the church. He was embezzling money from the church funds, and this was all proven. The church could not sack him. There was no authority on the local church level. We appealed to the church conference. It took them about 2 years to get this guy out of there. They didn't want to know. So it was very difficult, and it was a very troubling time to have to go through that. So again, there's strengths and weaknesses, aren't there, with every model. There's and that's not the only Presbyterian model. You could say, well, we'll do it another way. We have this nation or worldwide conference. Underneath that, in the local church level, you've got a board of elders, and then underneath that is your pastor. Now does that more similarly look like what your church is? Does anyone have anything like this? No one's part of a nationwide conference, are they?
Yeah, conference.
You are. So Assembly of God?
No. I know how they work.
What are you? Is it an independent church?
Independent church. Yeah.
Independent, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, many churches will go on this thing. Many of them.
Churches of God?
Yeah, many of them are the.
Yeah.
This system here. This model.
And now we've got strengths and weaknesses. Strengths, again, same kind of thing as before. Money that can support smaller churches. You've got a board, but then look at the position of the pastor now.
Yeah.
He or she is under the elders.
Yeah.
Now that could be a good thing. If you're a pastor, though, where's your authority? You have to run every decision through
them. And
we see a lot. If the pastor and the elder team have an antagonistic relationship, you're going to be in trouble.
Piano from one end to the
Yeah,
other.
and you see a power struggle oftentimes. And in a way, our church wasn't part of a national conference, but this is the way our church ran. When I was the pastor, every decision, I had no authority to make a decision. If people came and said, we need a decision, I can't make it because it has to go through the elder board. And if the elder board didn't want to do it, so people would come and say, well, why do we have you here? What's your point? My hands are tied. I can't do anything. And the elder board, if they didn't understand and I had a vision for the church that I believed God had given me, and they didn't buy into it. It was very
most of them, the pastor can go to the board meeting only if he's invited. It doesn't make sense.
So now, Peter, are you an elder?
Huh?
That's strange.
Oh,
I'm telling you,
so
I
you're
don't
a pastor,
few
you're
churches.
not an elder.
Hang on, I can't hear, sir.
I'm saying in church, in your church, are
Yeah.
you're not a pastor, but are you an elder?
Now,
Yeah.
we're planting a church.
You
I'm a church planter. I'm an apostle.
Oh, okay.
So now you have different,
He's a doctor.
completely different model. Look at this. This is more like a Baptist church, congregational government. The congregation is actually the final authority. Underneath the congregation, see, they flipped it on its head.
Yeah, this is,
My friend was a Baptist pastor, and this was basically how it ran.
I was brought up as a Baptist.
Yeah, every decision that needed to be made was voted on by the entire congregation. Again, strengths and weaknesses. You can see they try to be more democratic. Everyone's involved in the decision. However, weaknesses, the pastor is on the bottom in
Yeah.
terms of authority. He or she is going to have a difficult time if there's someone on the board or even just in the congregation who's a difficult person. And in this case, my friend had a very difficult woman. She essentially ran the church. She'd been there for 35 years. And if a decision was supposed to be made, if Mary didn't want it, it wasn't going to happen. Even if it was for the good of the church or whatever. If she wanted it, it would pass. So whenever it came to a vote on whatever issue, everyone would look over to Mary and see how she was voting. You know, and if she raised her hand, then everyone would raise their hand. And if she sat there like this, everyone would go, "Oh, I was going to raise my hand." They were afraid of her. She controlled the church. It was crazy. He fought her for 3.5 years, finally quit. And he said, when he resigned, he stood up and he said, he didn't point to her, but he said, "The reason I'm quitting is I've been trying to lead this church and trying to help this church for 3.5 years. It's been a constant battle, and it's very clear to me that you guys don't want to move forward, and I'm just going to stop. I'm quitting. I'm leaving. Goodbye." And this was the 4th or 5th pastor they'd gone through in the last 10 years with the same story. So it can be a very difficult thing. The last one is this connectional kind of model. You have an annual conference. Now this is something might be once a year then, whether it's again nationwide or worldwide even. I mean, the Nazarene church, my friends in Nazarene, this is what they do. They actually have a worldwide Nazarene conference. All the leaders and pastors that can make it go to, I mean, you're talking thousands of them. They go to they fill a stadium basically, because there's so many of them. They meet in different places around the world. Then you might have an area district, you know, maybe a statewide or county-wide or something like that, a synod, a superintendent minister who is in charge of an area. So he or she might oversee 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 churches. Underneath that, then you've got your minister, perhaps even a lay minister, and then a congregation. So again, a lot of levels to go down by the time you get to your local church. You know, so again, strengths and weaknesses. If you had a superintendent, you might have some good support if you were a lay minister or even a minister of this local church. You know, but again, making decisions, it's gonna have to go quite up the chain, isn't it, before anything gets done. You know, so every church structure is different, and you may have found elements of your church on here, even though you didn't see it exactly the way it was. Every church and there's strengths and weaknesses to every church model, isn't there? Because a lot of people have argued that there's only one correct model from Scripture, but it seems like Paul had different things in different places wherever he went. But he was pretty clear. He appointed teams of elders, didn't he? That's what he seemed to do pretty consistently in every church he went to that he planted. He would raise up a team of elders. He would train them up, and then he would move on. You know, so what that actually looks like, we're not exactly sure. But I think one thing is for sure, it's a team-based approach. That's what Paul stood for. He never appointed, you don't see it in Scripture, where he just appointed one person and said, "You're in charge. You don't have to answer to anyone, and now I'm off." He always adapted a team-based approach, didn't he? Which is why I'm always banging on about the Ephesians 4 thing, because that's a team-based value, isn't it? These fivefold gifts. All right, let's take our lunch break, and then we're going to come back and work on some theology. We're going to talk about contextual theology, which relates to your TH100. So we're going to start at 11:30
Half
you
12.
got 30, you got extra 5 minutes, don't you?
Okay? Okay, we put it up.